Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed, Part 3. Play the ad. Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their new 12th Gen CPU contact frame by DeBauer. It's well known that the integrated loading mechanism, or ILM, of the LJ1700 sockets bends 12th Gen CPUs, leading to an uneven contact surface that reduces cooling performance. Solving this issue, the contact frame replaces the ILM, allowing for a much more even contact with the CPU's IHS and the base of your cooler, which in turn reduces operating temperatures. Installation's quick and easy, and thanks to the use of anodized aluminium, the contact frame is non-conductive. And then, for those of you who wish to further maximize contact, Thermal Grizzly now offers an optional lapping tool, so for more information, please check the link in the video description. What are your expectations regarding Nvidia's possible release of a 4000 Super Series next year? I think it's pretty likely that we're going to see a Super Series early next year. Sort of a mid-cycle refresh, which would suggest that the next generation is probably coming a year after that.
Yeah.
So probably early 2025, I had to guess. What are the expectations? I expect them to be, so if you've got like a 4080 Super, probably a bit more VRAM, just a bit more out of that silicon, so not as cut down, so maybe 20 gigabytes of VRAM at a guess, and, you know, more cores and whatever, and they'd probably look to slot that in at that $1,200 US price point and then push the 4080 more officially down to where it is now. So what we've seen from the sort of Super generations in the past, I think the last time we had Super was Turing. So
yeah, I think it'll be an opportunity for Nvidia to adjust their GPU offerings to more where people would have expected the original launch to be, but obviously a year after, so they've been able to get all the sales of the less exciting products for the early adopter type people. But I very much think it'll be not reducing prices or anything like that. Very much as you said, where they look at the current price points, release new GPUs at those price points that are a little bit faster and a little bit more capable, which if that was the original launch would have become much more appropriate. Like instead of complaining about a 10% performance improvement, if it's more like a 20 or 30% performance improvement, then you would have been much more happy. But because it would be maybe more of a super release, then it'll be different. But I would expect, you know, an opportunity to adjust things like the $800 4070 Ti having more than 12 gigabytes of VRAM. They'll certainly have the opportunity to correct that with Super.
If there is a 4060 Super, and I'm pretty confident there'll be a 4070 Super, then those products could end up being quite decent. And like as you say, what we should have got the year prior.
You discontinue the 4060 Ti 8GB model to only offer like a 4060 Super or something that provides the level of VRAM that you would expect, and all along those sorts of things. I think, they've got the opportunity to do that, but, you know, like we saw with the 20 series Super products, they weren't that much faster. It wasn't like you were getting a revolutionary improvement.
Yeah, I think the further you went down the product stack, they were a bit more substantial. But yeah, like the 2080 Super, that was laughably bad from memory.
Well, the higher up the stack, the closer to the full silicon you were getting already.
That's right. There wasn't much wiggle room.
Yeah.
Whereas from the 4080 to the 4090, there's quite a large gap there to close up. So it could be more interesting, but ultimately I don't think it'll be terribly exciting. It'll just sort of a mid-cycle refresh that isn't quite what we saw with 14th gen refresh, but a bit more interesting than that.
Oh, it's going to be like you and your review is going to be comparing the Super Series to the non-Super Series, which is going to make them look a lot worse than if they had just launched the Super Series to begin with, and you were comparing like a 4080 Super to the 3080. That would have probably been a much better and more favorable solution.
Definitely.
But because they've sort of gone, we'll give you 10% one year, then 10% the next year, it's kind of, you know, not going to do too much. So, but
we'll see anyway.
We'll see what happens.
All right, Tim, an interesting one here. Would the RTX 4060 Ti 8GB justify its price if it required no 6-pin connector? Interesting question. I'm going to just say no straight off the bat. Really, RTX 4060 Ti 8GB, that's a $400 US product, and the 3060 Ti was a $400 product. And the 3060 Ti is faster in some instances, which is just unbelievably embarrassing for Nvidia. Not that they care. So yeah, really, for it to justify its price, it would have to be at minimum. Really, I think I think if I had to go a minimum spec for it to justify its price, it would have to have 12 gigabytes of VRAM and be at 20% faster. With 8 gigabytes of VRAM, it would have to be like 40% faster, but obviously you're still going to...
Basically, it would have to be a lower price. Like
it really needs more VRAM at that, because 8 gigabytes of VRAM is just not enough. Like, you make it 40% faster, and then it's starting to be able to use higher levels of ray tracing and stuff.
People will be like, I want to use this for Ultra. Like, it's got the performance for Ultra, but then doesn't have the VRAM for Ultra, so you get into that whole
it's like faster. It's like a 3080 with 2 gigs less VRAM at that point.
I guess with this question as well, it's like, I'm guessing the question is implying that you remove the power connector so you can use it in any system without PCI power without sacrificing performance, whereas the reality would be if you were only using the PCI power, which is limited to 75 watts or something, the performance of the card would be worse. So,
but even if it wasn't, even if it wasn't, no, because that's such a niche use case, and a lot of those use cases, like, how many, realistically, without being silly, how many instances does it make sense to spend $400 US on a graphics card to use it on like an old Dell system or something?
Yeah, it's not great. Like if we're talking about a 4050 or 4030 type product, then
that's less than $200.
Yeah,
but
4030 you'd hope would be
if we're talking about brand new expensive slim PCs, probably don't buy those if you intend on gaming or needing that kind of GPU power. Just buy a regular system would be the way to go.
Yeah, and if you've got an OEM system that's kind of crap and you want to put a GPU in and you don't have a power connector and you're spending $400, honestly, just buy a console. Seriously, buy a PS5.
Or get a normal ATX power supply. Gut that one that's in there. Usually you can buy like adapter, like cable harness type things that will adapt that to an ATX power supply. They're probably too expensive, but just get one of those, get an ATX power supply, duct tape that to the top of the case if you have to, if it doesn't fit in the proprietary kind of weird power supply area that they have in the case.
Write a note, don't buy stuff with proprietary stuff in the future.
Just duct tape that sucker on there and then use any graphics card, and that will be better.
Yep.
Moving on.
The platform costs, e.g. CPU, motherboard, RAM of Raptor Lake and Zen 4, while not outright terrible, are still not as affordable to gamers on a budget. With this in mind, would you still advise against budget-constrained gamers building a much cheaper Zen 3 or Intel 12th Gen DDR4 system, given the lack of an upgrade path? So we've talked about this, things like our podcast and a few other areas.
Yeah, I don't really see how 12th Gen DDR4 is particularly helpful because you're buying the same CPUs. I guess you're talking about like a 12400 or something like that, maybe. I don't think DDR4 and DDR5 pricing is wildly different these days. I mean, like, it might be that it's twice as expensive to get DDR5, but if you're talking about $40 versus $80, I don't think that's a big deal for the most part.
Yeah, I don't think it's twice as the price these days.
No, DDR5's come down a lot. I know DDR4 is still very cheap, but when you can buy a 32 gigabyte kit of DDR5 6000 CL30, which is what we use for testing AM5 parts for, like, I think it's down to $120, and there's similar stuff for about $100. So when you're talking about pretty close to the $100 mark for 32 gigabytes of high-speed memory, that's pretty good. Ryzen 5 7600, that's about, I think, $220. So you're looking at probably $80-ish for the 12th gen CPUs anyway that are locked. And then the motherboard prices will be about the same, like off the top of my head, ASRock B650M-HDV/M.2. They're getting like monitors now. I think that board's like $120. So, for decent, relatively new boards, you're looking at around the $100 mark for any platform. So you might save like $100 overall. But Ryzen 5 7600, high-speed, low-latency memory, and an entry-level motherboard, it's about $450 thereabouts. What's a Zen 3 going to get you down to? Like, even if it was $350, $100 off is reasonable, but you're going to be keeping the AM5 system largely, if not entirely, for 4 years, 5 years.
And it'll be slower.
Well,
from the start
it'll be a lot slower from the start. So you're looking at an investment of like $100 US a year for the core platform components. So saving what amounts to be like $25 a year or something on going the slower, cheaper option, I just don't see it being worth it. I would invest. My recommendation for even budget builders, if they're not going to buy a console, which is probably what you'd suggest, AM5 is where I would go with like a 7500F or a 7600 with a decent DDR5 kit, because you'll be able to carry that on for future. Really, my advice would be get a half decent AM5 board, some half decent memory, and you might be able to find yourself getting a much better, much faster CPU in a couple of years.
I think I would be tending my advice at the moment towards, I agree, definitely AM5, but I think part of the reason why AM5 hasn't quite had that value yet is we're still in the first generation of parts. So the entry-level stuff like 7600, still over $200 US, whereas obviously a lot of older AM4 stuff for a similar, like a 5600 and those sort of parts is below $200, which makes them seem a lot more affordable. I think once Zen 5 hits the market, we'll now have 2 generations on the platform, and that should mean that the Zen 4 processors that we now think are maybe a little too expensive will be occupying the $150-ish range, hopefully. Fingers crossed, because that's historically what's happened in the past with AM4, and is why often those products have been so compelling. Is the new Zen line would come out, the old products would get a lot cheaper, and suddenly that's when people would jump on board. Like they would go, okay, well now a 2600 is $130, so I'm going to jump on AM4 now and do my upgrade. So once Zen 5 comes out, and if we see pricing that's similar for the new Zen 5 parts, hopefully a 7600 will get a little cheaper. The motherboards will be another generation on. There'll be probably a second generation of motherboards. So that's when you could potentially be getting the Zen 4 CPU, the first generation AM5 motherboard for less. And that's when I think AM5 will really start coming into its own for budget builders. And I think Zen 5 is not that far away, like next year at some point. So if you can hold out, like it depends what platform you have right now, obviously, but if you can hold out just that bit longer until we start, like if you're a real budget builder, obviously I'm suggesting here, then I think, yeah, you'd be much better off getting AM5, a cheaper 7600 or something like that, and a cheaper motherboard. And yeah, then you'll have the option of upgrading to Zen 5 or hopefully like a Zen 6 CPU later. And then you'll be really set. I think that would be a good plan.
Yeah, exactly. And just to clarify, my push for something like a 7600 when you're recommending to budget buyers is, if someone's saying to me, should I spend like, Ryzen 5 5600, I think they're $120. You can probably get like a B450 board for $80.
Yep.
And then what's 32 gigabytes of DDR4 worth these days?
I don't know, $70, $80,
so
maybe a bit less
even if
than
it's
that.
50, you're at $250 there. So that's about $200 less, which is a significant saving compared to what I'm recommending. I just think that that's a better long-term investment. But again, if people are sitting there going, I can't believe you'd recommend that Zen 3 so much cheaper. Yeah, if you haven't got the budget to go past $250, then it's like,
you're limited, right?
the question answers itself. Like Zen 3 is probably the best value option, because I think even like 12th gen stuff, which is 13th gen, which is 14th gen, that's current LJ 1700 stuff. So anyway, essentially, if someone's on a relatively tight budget and they want a good core platform that's going to carry them well into the future, I think the recommendation, which we talked about on our podcast, right, for at length, we built 2 sort of budget systems, and both of us landed on the 7600, didn't we?
Yes, that's right.
With varying entry-level AM5 boards.
Yeah, we did $1,000 builds on the podcast, and yeah, it was very much like we could have upgraded the GPU slightly or something by going with the end-of-life platform. But yeah, I mean, I agree. Like if you have $250 and you're sort of limited, one of the options as well is wait and save a bit more money and save up. And I think even then, it's like I would still probably go with the wait. Like if you're limited to $250 right now,
if you can wait,
if you can wait, like your platform is still reasonable. Then if you wait 6 months to a year, then again, maybe that $250 gets you AM5 instead of AM4, or you will have saved up enough money that you can start thinking about an AM5 system and more into that budget that you're talking about. I obviously, when it comes to like cross generations, it becomes very tricky to sort of talk about recommendations. Back in the AM4 era, it's just like, well, this is the option.
What you're saying is it depends.
It definitely depends.
It depends, guys.
It depends.
So yeah, we'll move on. All right, Tim, I think this might be one that if we were going to do it, you would do it. Will you do a ranked video of the worst ports released this year? I know it's not the usual content, but outside of the fun factor, it could actually benefit some buyers in avoiding unoptimized games. Some, like Jedi Survivor, are still nowhere near where they should be, and that's months after the initial release.
It's probably not a video that we would do simply because we probably haven't looked or tested in depth every game that is a potential candidate for like a worst ports thing. But certainly this year, I was thinking like, what would I put on a list for that sort of thing? I mean, there's two games that come to mind straight away: Jedi Survivor, which is one that has been mentioned, and Starfield would be the other example that would sort of immediate red flags. And there's probably a few others that have been borderline examples, like Hogwarts Legacy, for example, didn't launch in the best state, but it was also a fairly heavy game to run, so how unoptimized it was. Similarly, complaints were had around like The Last of Us Part 1 when it launched. Now, I didn't think that was necessarily a super terribly unoptimized game, but certainly there were things that were improved over time with its CPU utilization, VRAM usage, and things like that. And
lower texture quality was improved.
Yeah, so we've got Cities Skylines 2 that we haven't really looked at because I don't think at this point it's out yet, but we're hearing reports of it having terrible performance. So that's obviously another example that could join a list like this. So yeah, I think every year there's sort of multiple examples of games that launch in really unacceptable states, and there are varying levels of acceptability. I think we've talked about extensively in the past whether we'd prefer like the low level of performance that a game like Starfield would provide versus a stuttering experience like a Jedi Survivor would provide.
Well, the funny thing about Jedi Survivor, because I copped a lot of flack on Twitter because I'm like, hey, this isn't playing that bad for me. I was playing it on a 7800X 3D, which turns out to be one of the better CPUs for running it. But I was using an RTX 4070, which is a lower end GPU. And if you keep the frame rate, I think I was playing at about 70 frames per second typically, using the Epic quality settings at, I think, 4K. Might have been 1440p, but it was around that 70 FPS range, which is quite acceptable. And there was very little traversal stutter. Balin had a 1300K with a 4090, and his was really, really bad. And it seems like, because it was designed to be played on console or whatever, they had a frame rate target in mind where the game's actually... So if you head towards 60 FPS with a good CPU, it's actually not bad. So I played that game and really enjoyed it. Didn't really have any issues. Last of Us Part 1 played that on the 7800X 3D with the RX 6800, so the non-XT version. That was buttery smooth. Played perfect on Ultra 1440p. Played through that for multiple hours, and I was like, the hell, this game runs really well. So, and they were two of the more enjoyable single-player games, in my opinion. Like, Starfield was super boring, didn't enjoy that at all. Hogwarts Legacy was okay. Not my style of game, but that played through pretty well on the hardware I had used. Admittedly, I think I did play that on a... Actually, I started on a 4070 Ti and ran out of VRAM because it was so badly optimized, and then went to the 4090 and it was fine, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the difficulty with optimization. It's always the discussion of like, are you just running on hardware that's too slow, or is it actually badly optimized? I think Jedi Survivor is badly optimized. I think Starfield is certainly heading that way and probably would make that sort of list.
Well, if you Jedi Survivor, you can't play like high refresh rate.
Very much. So, I had a bad experience with that game, especially towards the end with lots of issues.
Yeah, so, it seems like the more frames you drive, the worse the traversal stutter gets.
And then there are some titles where it's just people playing on ultra settings and complaining that they're not getting the performance that they would expect, but the game may run and look great on like a high or even medium settings. I think of like a Cyberpunk 2077, which is now generally accepted to be quite a well-optimized title. I think, back when that game launched, people were like, oh, I just cannot play this on Ultra. And obviously there was all the issues around the game crashing and having graphical glitches and things. But over time, it's become accepted that actually the game is quite well optimized. So it's a very difficult discussion. Like, you make a video and it's so subjective. Like, you really would have to look into various different areas of how the game works and whether they're coding the game properly. Like, that's really what an optimization thing should be about. So yeah, very complicated. Can't see us diving into it too much this year at any time, really.
Having heard the news about Cities Skylines 2 and that they haven't hit their performance targets, will this affect your decision on whether it should be included in your test suite in any way? What are the criteria for adding/removing a game from the testing suite?
I think if anything, if it underperforms and performs like crap, that is more reason to include it, because the worse it runs, the more you want to be interested in that performance.
Yeah, I would probably look. I when it comes to the 30, 40, 50 game benchmarks, anything that's new or interesting, as Tim said, because of performance related issues, or it's popular, we generally just try to include that anyway because it's of interest. When it comes to day one reviews, where we only include maybe 12-ish games, we wouldn't include a game like that because it's likely that it will see performance improvements. It could be having problems with like GeForce GPUs or Radeon GPUs that gets addressed, sort of like what we see in games more like Starfield, though Nvidia has released a few drivers for that now, but we wouldn't have included that like straight away when it was quite clear that Radeon GPUs were performing much better than they should have been relative to GeForce GPUs. So there's no real criteria. It just sort of has to make sense according to a few different things.
I think if it was like an early access game and it was labeled that way, it was an actual Steam early access title, something like Baldur's Gate 3, which was in early access for many years through Steam, I think we'd probably shy more away from including that if it's sort of a preview that is expected to improve. And I think that's where the developer of Cities Skylines 2 has kind of failed a bit here, is that if they're coming out and they're acknowledging that the game has performance issues and it's not an early access title, so they're selling it at full price and saying this is the finished version, but it's finished with issues, then that creates all these problems where basically gamers are expecting this to be the final version and we would be more inclined to test it. Whereas if it's, again, more early access, then it's sort of more appropriately marketed for what they're sort of saying. So, yeah, there's kind of a disconnect there with the developers, but certainly I don't think would affect too much, our decision to just omit it entirely from
no, like if we were interested in testing the game with a dedicated video, we would do that anyway. We would probably look to include it in big benchmark videos, but not day one content where we want accurate, reliable data that's not going to change at the drop of a hat or favor certain hardware configurations too much.
Yeah, it seems like a fairly CPU limited game. So it'd be interesting for the CPU.
I think it's everything limited at the moment.
Well, probably, yeah.
I think I'll take care of this one.
Go for it.
What are your current go-to, I don't know why that had, anyway, motherboard brands for stability and reliability? I wish I could say that there was a brand that was always reliable and stable and the best go-to brand. I don't have a go-to brand for motherboards. It could be that for AM5, Gigabyte's the best. It could be that for AM4, MSI is the best. It could be for LGA 1700 that Asus is the best. And it could even be that certain models at certain price points are the best. So it's a tough one. Like B450, B450 MSI was very good. B550, everyone was quite good. It really depends.
It depends.
Whenever buying a motherboard, you really do have to do a lot of research. I think more recently, with the current platforms, board manufacturers are definitely doing a better job because there has been a bit more scrutiny placed on things like VRM performance and features and stability and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, generally speaking, but then, we saw the Asus. I wasn't impressed with the Asus boards on AM5. I pretty much, what's the word I can use? Didn't have nice things to say about their X670 or B650, especially the more entry-level boards, and then it turned out they had the voltage issues that were causing some chips to melt, and that could have been potentially could have been a problem on a range of different boards, but it was more prevalent with Asus boards. Anyway, as I said, do your research. Don't just go, I bought a Gigabyte board last time, it was really good, so I'm going to buy a Gigabyte board again, because you could be buying the absolute worst board for that platform. So you just have to research. All right, Tim, I've just seen this one. Quick scan of it. I know what it's all about. I guess here we go. God, our Discord users hate us. I'm probably going to let you lead with this one.
Great.
Because that way, if it goes poorly, I can be like, Harbour Unboxed doesn't condone any views or opinions of Tim.
Right.
We've let Tim go.
We can cut your section out of editing later.
All right, I'll read it out. Is frame generation the biggest scam of the decade?
Oh boy!
I think we
All
have to
right.
establish first if it's even a scam.
So this is a hot take, right? Like this is the Reddit. This is like a Reddit comment that you would see from a hater, or like a YouTube comment from a hater, sort of thing. Yeah, I think I agree. We have to establish whether it's a scam or not, and I would say it's not a scam. A scam is something that's pretty deceptive, is very misleading, and you're sort of not getting what is advertised. I think that advertising around frame generation hasn't been great, like the whole it improves performance
That was deceptive,
angle.
for sure.
That was deceptive. The whole your frame rate goes up, therefore your performance is better, wasn't accurate in my opinion, or at least wasn't fully accurate. But most other aspects of how it was described is how it works. So things like it is genuinely generating the frames from no input from the game engine is effectively how
That's
it
right.
works.
It'd be a scam if it wasn't doing that and just artificially doubling the number.
Yeah, exactly.
That would
Like
be a
if it was
scam.
duplicating the frames instead of generating like an interpolated intermediary frame between two frames. And again, I just said that it doesn't use input from the game engine, which isn't fully true. It does use things like motion vectors to inform how to do the generation part. But hopefully you know what I meant there. So most of what Nvidia was saying about how it works is how it works. Things like it's built off of DLSS technology. It sort of is using the tensor cores and an AI network to assist with the process. All of that seems to be accurate. So from that perspective, I don't agree that it's a scam. But scam is often used as sort of like a code for bad, or used to sell something that isn't really giving you the full value that you would expect. And I think it's hasn't been great to have it as a feature that you're effectively buying these GPUs for. Because 40 series, in many respects, there hasn't been too many upgrades over the 30 series, so frame generation has been elevated to an additional level than it otherwise would have been if the generation was really compelling in terms of like cost per frame and performance and things. So yeah, from that front, that hasn't been great, but I think scams are more things like Nvidia downgrading. Like in a previous question, we've just been talking about like a GT 1030 DDR4. That is much more of a scam. Whether or not that is a scam is still, I don't know, would that quite get over my threshold, but it's way closer.
Yeah, it is.
So yeah, I don't think it's a scam, but like I get where this question's coming from, right? Like people wanted a real performance uplift, a cost per frame improvement with a new generation, and what they got instead was largely
Highly
frame
deceptive
generation,
marketing.
which, yeah, like I can understand why you'd be very disappointed with that and frustrated and annoyed and think that it's, not great. So, yeah, but I mean, there are some circumstances where using frame generation does improve the experience. So I don't want to sit here saying it's all bad and useless technology and is constantly terrible, because there are some scenarios where it does improve the overall package, but those circumstances are certainly less than what we were led to believe to begin with, and it's a more narrow technology, and I think I was hoping, and I think that you were hoping as well. So, yeah, very inflammatory comment there, but hopefully we've sailed the seas smoothly on that one.
Hopefully I don't have to let Tim go after this Q&A series.
That's all right. I've already bought a box for my belongings.
All right. How can one man, Hub Steve, release the 14700K review at the same time as bigger channels like GN? When we hear GN Steve at the end of their 14700K video praising their big crew working at a pace behind the scenes to make such content available that soon. What is your secret? Well,
is the secret the NDA?
Well, that's how we were going at the same time. I mean, GM would have worked really hard on their content, and they had multiple people working on it. That's really good. To be fair, we do as well. So, like all the excellent B-roll and great CPU shots you saw in the video, they were all done by our video editor Balin, who's also our B-roll guy. So he spent hours filming all of that, and then he spent hours editing the video. So really all I had to do was test the CPU, write the script, sit in front of the camera for a bit of it, record it, done. So, but, I knew these CPUs were coming out. I knew they were coming up, and I thought, well, a week out, I should probably update all of my comparative data. So I started working on it a week in advance, which helps a lot. Got the CPUs, added them to the data. And yeah, I mean, it's a scramble. It's long 18-hour days, but that's how we get it done. But I can't, while Steve GN Steve gave his team credit for helping out. I just took all the credit. That's my secret. I just didn't acknowledge Balin. I'm like, Balin, just go do it. It'll make me look good.
I think part of this as well was that you had chosen to do all 3 CPUs in one video because of how boring it was.
Gamers Nexus did a lot more work
I think
than
they
I
did.
did in that
Did
sense.
they do a video for each individual CPU?
I spoke to Steve about that, and he told, because we chatted a bit about the launch and what we thought of the CPUs and stuff, and there was a lot of generation stuff back and forth between us. And yeah, he said we're going to do I actually said to him, there's no way I'm doing 3 videos. They don't justify that in my opinion. They're too boring. And he was like, yeah, we'd already committed to the 3 videos, so we're going to go ahead and do that. I said, fair enough. So they did 3 videos, which, it's the same amount of testing and all that, but then having to create all the graphs 3 times instead of once.
Triple the production work. So
make 3 scripts instead of 1 script. So they did significantly more work in that sense, in the video production sense, than what we did, because we just thought it didn't justify it. The 14700K was the only new, I guess you could say, part, because it had some extra E-cores.
Sure. It is new,
I'm being generous.
Yeah.
But anyway, but thank you. But yeah, we all worked hard on our content, and like Steve, I got a few other people involved that I don't give credit to because I want to take all the credit.
Yeah, and I did nothing on that, so that was good.
All right, Tim, part 3's over. Q&A series is over. It's always disappointing when we get to the end of it. I have fun answering the questions, and we had a couple of laughs here and there. Thank you to everyone who asked a question. We had a lot of good ones this month, a lot of,
And we will never admit the months that there's the bad ones.
Yeah.
We'll hide that deep down inside.
Yeah, that's deleted footage, us commenting on the bad months. But no, this was a genuinely good month. Yep. So that's good.
Lots of stuff happening.
Yeah, lots of stuff happening. Lots of things coming up. I reckon next month will be good as well, because we can follow up on some of the stuff that we didn't have sort of concrete answers on for this month. But anyway, that's going to do it. We're going to go do our Patreon/Floatplane supporters live stream and answer all their silly questions. You have no idea with those guys. Far out. You thought the Q&A was bad. We're going to go do that. If you would like to become a Patreon or Floatplane member, so I can tell everyone else how stupid you are, then do that. The links are in the video description. You'll get the live stream that I just mentioned, where I'll abuse you directly. There's also the Discord server where I can do that in text form if you'd like. Behind the scenes content. And yeah. Anyway, so check that out if you're interested. That's perfectly fine. And we would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim.
See you next time.